I'm Jennifer Bair, and I teach at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I'm an associate professor of sociology there and a faculty research associate in the institutions program at the Institute of Behavioral Science.
Great. And how do you use the global value chain framework to do your research and work?
Well, I come at the questions of global value chains largely through an interest in development. And what we've seen basically really since the 1980s is that it's essentially impossible now to really think about development without simultaneously trying to understand where particular regions, countries fit into these global value chains. So for me, I'm coming at it really with an interest in sort of the relationship between, development that is taking place kind of on the ground in situ and how that's being shaped by a region's insertion or sometimes non-insertion or exclusion from global value chains. So I'm interested both in those questions of incorporation, but also the conditions under which sometimes regions are expelled from or excluded from global value chains and what the consequences for that can be for local firms, workers, communities, etc.
Fascinating. And what are you learning here at the Duke Global Summit that you can take back with you as you attempt to do these research and answer these questions?
Well, I think what's unique about the summit is the opportunity for academics and policymakers, practitioners from these international organizations to kind of get together. So it's sort of a state of the field, but what we see are both the ways in which there's now kind of a broad acceptance of global value chains and also some areas where there continues to be maybe some points of contention or maybe somewhat disparate understandings of what that term means and how it's used. So on the one hand, I think one of the most fascinating things that we've learned at this summit is the degree to which now there's a pretty broad consensus that we need better metrics to simply track the existence of these global value chains. And we heard some exciting developments, particularly around the trade and value added as a sort of new way of trying to get at something we've known for a long time, which is that it's really difficult with kind of conventional trade statistics to think about the extent of these global value chains. And we're moving, I think, in the direction of sort of repurposing some of these older trade statistics for thinking about these new questions. At the same time, we're thinking about how to create new forms of data that we don't have, in particular data sources that would get at questions of sort of inter-firm links, which are really, kind of the heart of the global value chain paradigm. And I think what we've seen at the summit is that we still have some thinking to do about how to conceptualize what kind of data we need at that level, but then also the really tricky question about, how it would be collected. And so I think having the international organizations at the table for those conversations has hopefully been mutually beneficial, both for the academics and for the practitioners. I think there are some interesting points of contention about how much a global value chain perspective sort of changes the way that we think about some policy questions with regard to the relationship between trade and development. And I think that the summit has been uniquely useful in revealing, in a sense, sort of some of those disjunctures. So I think it's been a very productive, conversation. It's kind of necessary to understand where there are points of agreement and where there might be some kind of continued debates in order to move those debates forward, hopefully both in the academic literature and then also in the kind of policy conversations.
Great. So one final question. Looking ahead over the next 3 to 5 years, several years, what are the significant challenges that you've identified in your research that are important as we are trying to handle a changing global economy? And then how can the global value chain framework help us to better understand or to make policy suggestions for these challenges?
That's a great question. I think there's probably 3 areas that interest me. The first one is this whole question of labor and environmental compliance in global value chains, this question of what's often referred to as social upgrading, and the degree to which global value chains are sufficient or not to achieve those ends. And I think the emerging consensus is that global value chains may well be necessary, but they probably aren't sufficient. And so then the question is, what other kinds of perspectives, or how do we need to tweak our understanding of global value chains as a pathway to economic upgrading to incorporate then that kind of social dimension. So, for example, there are lots of interesting questions to be asked and answered, hopefully, about the role of lead firms, and do different kinds of lead firms create different sorts of opportunities for social upgrading is a lot of what needs to happen in terms of facilitating social upgrading more a question of, let's say, no national or regional regulation, maybe supranational regulation? What are some new and emergent kinds of maybe regulatory or even legal regimes, private or public, or maybe hybrid public-private governance, that can potentially push us towards better outcomes in terms of the social upgrading questions? And I think the consensus that's emerging is that we are going to need to bring other kinds of perspectives into this global value chain conversation in order to really kind of push that frontier on social upgrading forward. And I'm thinking here about, questions of social difference broadly, gender, race, ethnicity, sort of how we incorporate those, in some ways old questions from the development paradigm into a new GVC perspective that can really try to move social upgrading to kind of the center of the conversation without losing sight of the economic upgrading issues that really have been so central to the GVC conversation for a long time. So thinking again about governance as a central concept and how governance relates both to economic grading and social upgrading. So that's one area. The second area is really on regional integration and regional value chains. And there's been a lot of conversation at the summit about the degree to which, some parts of the world or some countries aren't ready or aren't able to participate in global value chains. It makes more sense for them to target regional value chains or maybe domestic value chains. How to potentially think about regional integration as a way to help countries sort of learn how to compete in global value chains as a kind of stepping stone. And I think that's something that we're going to continue to see be particularly important in particular regions. So I think Latin America is a good example, Central America, certain parts of Africa is a place where regional integration and the relationship between regional integration and global value chains is going to become increasingly important. And it's a complicated relationship because sometimes the sorts of chains that you're developing in particular regions, maybe because of trade preferences that those regions have towards particular markets, really can complicate later efforts to insert into global value chains. So that's a really, I think, exciting research frontier and one that a lot of folks are thinking about right now. And the third and last area that I think is going to be important, and again, I think we're starting to hear a lot about it at the summit, is how to think about places that aren't, in fact, in global value chains. So on the one hand, we have, I think there's a consensus that global value chains as a framework is really important to understand what's going on in any particular industry. But there are some locations in the world that don't have a lot of participation in global value chains. I think the question is not just how can we increase the participation, but sort of, why that's happening and what are the consequences of that sort of exclusion, and sometimes expulsion, right? So one region comes into a global commodity chain or global value chain, and other regions kind of might be pushed out. And so trying to figure out why that happens, the conditions under which that happens, and what can be done about it, I think is something that's important. And because we tend in our study of global value chains to kind of trace the chain, figuring out how to essentially look at why some places aren't in those chains is a methodologically difficult question, but I think ultimately an important one for, again, moving understanding of the relationship between global value chains and development outcomes, both economic and social, forward.
Okay.